I remember like 10 years ago when I was really little. I'm under 30, so this wasn't very long ago. Riding around with my dad. This was in the very early 2000s when gasoline was really expensive. My dad talked about how gasoline was going up so high. He was like, oh man, this gas is getting too high. I responded with, well, if it's so high, why doesn't the oil companies make it cheaper? And my dad laughed and he said, well, that would make sense, son, but the oil companies do not set prices. It's the companies where the oil comes from. And I always thought that was weird, but now that I've become more discerning, become more intelligent, I understand the reasoning behind it. So before OPEC, oil production levels and world prices were determined by seven sisters, the oil companies themselves. To make it easy, I will just use their current names. They had different names. Oil was kind of complicated because you basically had Standard Oil. They broke up Standard Oil through antitrust laws. And you had these small subsidiaries. And then those small subsidiaries ended up all coming back together to create the oil giants like BP, ExxonMobil, Chevron, all those companies that we have today. So basically you had BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil. The only company I remember is Texaco, but apparently that's merged into Chevron now. That's kind of how our crony capitalist system works. These large corporations control all the resources. So these countries were in brazen defiance of American antitrust law, but the government in Washington didn't care. They were exceedingly compliant, and that's because they needed oil to power their tanks, power their choppers, power their planes, power their military. But not only that, but also because strategic area of Saudi Arabia, its vicinity to the Red Sea and the way it was positioned towards the Gulf. Really good for the United States Navy. So once these companies had control over Saudi oil and made investments necessary to build up the country's production capacity, it became possible for them to use the capacity of what became the swing producer, the only country with the ability to rapidly increase its production by an extra million or 2 barrels per day of oil in order to affect prices in the international oil market. Prices were thus kept very low. They were at $1.80 per barrel in 1963, down to $1.20 in 1969. That's why you always have older people say, back when I was young, oil was only a nickel. Yeah, because you had these oil companies artificially keeping the oil prices low, thereby fueling the enormous expansion of the economies of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan from World War II onward. So it fueled their military, it fueled their cars, their trucks, their trains, everything they needed. The revenues of the oil-producing countries who made this possible were considerably smaller than if they had controlled the production themselves. This situation began to be transformed with the establishment in 1960 of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is OPEC, of which Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia were founding members. After a series of moves in the late 1960s and early 1970s by producing countries to assert their control over their own resources, and after the Arab oil boycott of 1973, prices of oil came to be set by a producers' cartel rather than by one representing the economies of the major consumers of oil. So it's quite simple. These companies that produce the oil, they want to make a lot of profit from their resource. I get all that. Capitalism, that's the way it works. The countries that were consuming the oil, they wanted prices to be low to make it cheaper for their countries to expand militarily and economically. Prices in consequence shot up, producing massive increases in revenues for the producers and a massive increase in prices for the consumers. It did nothing to stop the companies dominating the shipping, refining, the production, and market of all the Middle Eastern oil. It did nothing to help the citizens of these Middle Eastern countries. Despite increased revenues, the governments in these countries became filthy rich and didn't invest the revenues back to the people. That's why you have, like, the House of Saud. They live like kings. They have huge baths, huge palaces. Because they take all that money, they become oligarchs. Same thing in all these Middle Eastern countries. That's why the government's super rich. But they do invest in these stupid missile systems and weapon systems they never use. But they don't invest into the people. You had one particular individual who did. That was Muammar Gaddafi, but he's no longer with us. He invested back into his own people. He gave them an annual oil allowance. He gave them a home. He gave them health care. He gave them all. They had a high literacy rate and all this other stuff. But because they were not going along with the international bankers, he was going to use the golden dinar, and all of Africa was going to use that golden currency, and the Rothschilds were going to lose their funny money. Look up the Federal Reserve if you're into that shit. They had to end his life. Not saying he wasn't a bad guy, not saying he wasn't a tyrant, but Gaddafi was a threat to the power structure, and they needed him to be executed. If you look at Libya now, you have sex slaves, you have a horrible economy, it's a shithole. Libya at one point had the highest literacy rate in Africa, so that tells you something there. But thank you for watching my series, and I will get into some other things later on, like the British Empire and how the United States also uses the same tactic. Because this is a textbook tactic they use. They control the grain, they control all the pesticides, all of the world's food supply, and they do the same shit. That's kind of how the oligarchs, the establishment works. So this is a textbook. If you want to see how it really works, look into this stuff. Who controls the resources, the oil, the gas, the money. That's real wealth.